32 students filed into a bright classroom at 8:00 a.m., the air still carrying the chalky sweetness of yesterday's lessons. They laughed, swapped notes, tapped pencils, and thought nothing of the man already waiting by the blackboard. Daniel Mercer had once been praised, then ridiculed, and finally erased from the world of science. But in his drawer lay a box of chalk he had renamed his final experiment. He knew which class would sit. He knew which questions they would answer. And as the first line screeched across the board, the dust that fell was not the same as before. The blackboard was no longer a tool of learning. It was a stage of slow poison, humiliation, and revenge. This is the story of Daniel Mercer, the teacher with a hidden formula, and the day ordinary chalk became a weapon of death. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. At 7:42 a.m., the ER lights trembled, thin neon bars humming above a row of silver rails. Oxygen hissed. Monitors chirped and corrected themselves. A girl lay stiff on the bed, teeth chattering, fingers curled. White dust marked her cuticles and the creases of her palm. The room smelled of alcohol swabs and hot wires. A nurse pressed cold gel to her chest. The gel shone under the light like a strip of ice. They rolled a cart closer. Stainless instruments clinked, a small bright sound swallowed by the machine's steady tone. "Hold still," a voice said. The girl could not hear it. Her lips were pale. A thin smear of white traced the edge of her sleeve where fabric met skin. A paramedic tore open a packet. Paper ripped like a breath. He glanced at a backpack on the floor and nudged it away with his shoe. At 8:03 a.m., the chapel across the street held a small white coffin on trestles. Carnations drooped in warm air. Wax bled down the sides of 2 candles and pooled at the brass dish. Children in clean uniforms stood in a crooked line, hands at their sides, throats tight. Their voices rose, then cracked, then fell apart. A mother stroked the lid with the back of her fingers as if dusting a desk she did not own. Back in the ER, the doctor's breath fogged his face shield at the edges. He read numbers that ticked and steadied, then slid again. 2 milligrams, he said. The needle entered the vein. The girl's skin was cool, not cold. Her breath found a thin path, then narrowed. The monitor stepped into a faster rhythm, then tripped. The nurse dabbed her fingertips with a gauze square. White dust transferred to white cotton and vanished into it. At 8:11 a.m., a trolley rattled down the hallway, wheels squealing at a gap in the tile. The smell shifted to something metallic, a bright penny note under the antiseptic. A tech pushed past with a microscope case and a cup of coffee gone cold. The coffee tasted like coins. He set the case on a counter that had already collected a faint grit. He brushed it aside with the back of his hand and smeared a pale line across the steel. In the chapel, the choir tried again. Their first note came clean. The second drifted flat and hung there. The air carried the sweet, chalky smell of school on clothes not yet washed. A boy touched his sleeve and rubbed his fingers together, puzzled by a powder he could not see but could feel. It scratched. He put his hand in his pocket and pressed it into a coin to scrape it away. At 8:19 a.m., the ER lights steadied. The girl's jaw unclenched by a fraction. The nurse pulled the backpack onto the bed and unzipped it for identification. The zipper teeth grated. Inside lay notebooks, a pencil case, a folded lunch menu, and a small blue plastic box with a cracked hinge. She clicked it open. 6 sticks of chalk lay in a neat row, tips blunted by use, their sides labeled in a teacher's square hand. One had a narrow gray vein running its length. She raised it and left a dust print on her glove. "It's just school stuff," someone said from behind the curtain. The nurse nodded and set the box on the counter near the sink. Her glove left a small white crescent on the lid. She peeled the glove away. The powder on her wrist felt dry and soft, then stung faintly, as if she had rubbed a cut with citrus. She washed her hands. The smell flashed sharp, almost like burnt hair, then disappeared under soap. At 8:27 a.m., the doctor ordered labs. Vials filled, warm against the palm, then cooled as they lined the tray. The numbers moved again. The girl's breath thinned. A tremor began in her right foot and climbed to the knee. The nurse glanced at the blue box and slid it farther from the sink to keep it dry. The hinge squealed. A crumb broke from the gray-veined stick and fell. It crushed under the plastic foot of the box and spread into a stain no one noticed. In the chapel, the priest tapped the coffin twice with a ringed knuckle, a quiet, precise sound like chalk striking slate. The candles flickered and guttered, then took the flame again. A draft moved through and lifted the drooping carnation heads for a breath before they bowed lower. A girl in the second row coughed into her sleeve and stared at the white smear it left. At 8:33 a.m., the ER printer spit out a strip of paper. The doctor read the peaks and troughs. His pen left a thin blue groove across the form. "Again," he said, "another dose, another thin path of breath." The white dust on the counter caught a shaft of light and glittered. Under the microscope later, those grains would look too regular, too heavy, too bright. The nurse picked up the blue box again to log personal effects. She clicked the lid closed and slid it into a clear bag. The plastic fogged with her breath. She wrote a case number. The chalk rapped once against the box wall and left a mark inside the bag like a fingerprint. She sealed it and set it aside. "We'll return it," she said to no one. At 8:39 a.m., the girl's hand loosened just enough to open. The white lines on her palm smudged and faded but did not disappear. The ER felt colder. The neon hummed louder. Somewhere a speaker crackled and then went silent. In the chapel, the choir stopped trying. The chalk was supposed to write lessons. Today it wrote on skin. But this was only the beginning. At 7 a.m., Westfield High opened to clean light. The corridors shone. Floor wax held the smell of lemon and warm plastic. Lockers clicked in quick rows. A vent hummed above the trophy case and pushed a thin drift of chalk dust into the sun. It floated like slow snow and clung to sweatshirts and hair. A custodian dragged a mop across the vestibule, left a wet stripe, and leaned the handle against the wall. The stripe dried to a dull skin. By 7:25 a.m., students threaded past posters for a science fair and a spring concert. The paper edges curled from the tape. Shoes squeaked. Backpacks brushed the glass of the case and left ghost prints. The intercom coughed, cleared, and gave a short bell. Doors opened and shut with soft wooden thuds. A cafeteria cart rattled over a seam in the tile. The day moved by its ritual. Daniel Mercer stood in room 214. He was thin. His white coat showed old chalk rubs at the pockets and elbows. The lenses of his glasses fogged at the corners when he breathed and cleared when he turned. He wiped the board with a long felt eraser that left a pale smear. He tapped the eraser once on the metal tray. A neat stripe of white settled and glowed in the even light. He took a stick of chalk from a blue box and turned it in his fingers until the stamped brand faced the wall. Students arrived in bursts. They held outlines, coffees, and gym passes. Their voices were bright but low. "Morning," someone said. He nodded. He set the chalk on the tray and straightened a row of beakers that had already been washed. The glass clinked once, a tight, clean sound. The room smelled of paper, heat vents, and the faint powder of gypsum. A clock above the door ticked seconds into the paint. At 8 a.m., the class settled. The sunlight shifted a notch and drew a line across the front desks. Dust moved across that line in slow swirls, visible only when it turned. A girl in the second row rubbed her thumb and forefinger and frowned at the pale grit that didn't brush away. "Open to chapter 12, he said. His voice was even. He lifted the chalk and set its tip to the slate. The first stroke squealed. The sound bit into the room and bounced. Heads lifted. He paused a fraction, then wrote again. The second line dragged lower, softer, but still sharp at the end. Letters marched in clean white, their edges crisp and dry. He underlined once. The chalk left a little pile of dust along the groove. He blew on it. The dust rose and hung. A few students coughed, brief dry coughs that passed as quickly as they started. He broke the class into pairs for a quick set of problems. Paper moved. Pencils hit the paper. The steady scratch filled the space between the ticks of the clock. A heater clicked and then eased into a low hum. The light was gentle and flat. He walked the aisles and brushed each desk with a palm as he passed to guide a page or square a notebook. His coat sleeve brushed the board tray and picked up a faint white line. At 8:17 a.m. the eraser hit slate again. He wiped, and a dark rectangle returned, still faintly stamped with old lessons. The board did not go clean now. It never went clean. It held a fog of memory under the new words. He wrote a formula in a single breath, pausing only to chalk a bracket. The chalk tip made a dry click against the tray between numbers. When he reached for it again, the tip had warmed in his fingers. Two students near the windows traded seats so they could see through the glare. A boy tucked a tissue under his nose and pinched once. The smell in the room shifted. It was still gypsum and paper, but a thin metallic note threaded it. It sat on the back of the tongue and turned water flat. A girl twisted the cap of her bottle and sipped. "Taste weird," she whispered. Her partner shook his head and kept writing. The clock ticked. He moved to the sink and opened the tap to rinse a beaker. The water ran cold and clear, then steadied at lukewarm. Steam didn't form. The stainless surface around the basin wore a dusting of white where the eraser had shed. He brushed a path with 2 fingers and left a shiny track. He dried the beaker with a paper towel and pressed the towel once against the board to lift a smear. The towel kept a pale print and went into the trash with a soft fall. At 8:29 a.m. the intercom hissed and delivered an announcement about buses. The sound turned the room thin and tinny. Once the static cut, quiet settled harder than before. He wrote again. The chalk squeaked once, then again, shorter. Students looked up and then down. The squeal didn't last. It left a memory of abrasion, a noise you kept hearing after it stopped. A faint, sharp smell edged the air, not strong, enough to wrinkle a nose and then smooth it. He passed back lab sheets. His fingers were dry and dusted. The sheets carried prints like pale petals in the margins. Each student traced them without thinking, then flipped the page. Pencils moved. The heater clicked off and the room cooled half a degree. Breath showed for a moment in front of one girl when she laughed under it, then didn't. At 8:36 a.m. he drew a small diagram of lattice and ions. The chalk made little taps when he dotted labels. He lowered the eraser and blurred an arrow to show motion. The blur left a long gray lane across the lower quadrant. He tapped the eraser on the tray again. The sound was the same as before. The dust that fell was a little heavier. It slid rather than floated. No one noticed the difference in its weight. Weight was not a sound or a smell. It was a refusal to rise. He passed a hand over the words to shade a region. His cuff brushed the tray. White lined the edge like frost. He smoothed it with his thumb and left his thumb pale. When he touched the desk, the print transferred with a clean crescent. A boy pressed his nail into the chalk on the desk and made a small squeak of his own. At 8:41 a.m., a guidance counselor knocked and entered with a smile that didn't reach anyone. She dropped off forms and left a sparkle of perfume that gnawed at the chalk smell before fading. The door clicked shut. The bell schedule posted behind it fluttered once, then lay flat. He returned to the board. He marked a final set of terms. The chalk slipped from his grip once and tapped the tray, then rolled and stopped against the lip. He picked it up and pinched it harder. The room waited. The clock ticked 3 clean beats. He drew a straight line with pressure. The sound went high and thin and carried to the back wall. The chalk gave under that pressure. A fine crack whispered up its length. He tightened his hold. The line reached the margin. He pulled back for one more stroke to finish the bracket. The stick broke. It snapped with a dry, close sound that turned heads. The front half struck the slate, left a white scar, and dropped. The back half stayed in his fingers. A vein ran the broken face from end to end, a narrow gray core like ash pressed into bone. A faint smoke note rose and vanished. The board had been a window. Now it was glass you could not see through. At 9 a.m., the archives of Westfield University opened to a narrow hall of dust and fluorescent buzz. Old posters lined the cork boards, colors drained by time, staples rusted to brown dots. Daniel Mercer had once walked these same corridors as a graduate student. His coat was new then, his notebooks crisp, his handwriting sharp as wire. Professors had nodded in passing but not lingered. His desk sat near the back of a shared lab, under a vent that dripped condensation in winter and baked dry in summer. The air smelled of bleach and rubber gloves. At 9:15 a.m. he prepared samples for a demonstration. Small beakers lined up, labels written in square block letters. The chalkboard behind him held clean equations in white. He turned once to write another set, the stick sharp against the slate. A classmate leaned in to whisper. "Unoriginal," the voice said low. The chalk squealed as it struck the surface. He pressed harder. The squeal split the room like glass scored for cutting. Students laughed. Their voices rang against metal tables. The chalk in his hand snapped and dropped to the tray. The broken half rolled and fell, leaving a pale line across the floor tile. His scholarship ended that spring. The notice arrived folded into 3 creases. Words spoke of insufficient innovation and lack of originality. The letter smelled of ink and machine oil. He carried it folded in his coat pocket until it frayed at the edges and stained from sweat. The desk was reassigned. His nameplate was scraped off with a flat screwdriver. White flakes of adhesive clung to the metal slot like dandruff. At 10 a.m. he boxed his belongings. Books, pens, a single blue plastic case of chalk left from a teaching seminar. He kept the chalk separate. It rattled softly with each step down the hall. In the stairwell a student bumped him. The case slipped. One stick cracked. He bent to collect both halves. The broken face looked like cut bone. He slid them back into the case and held it tighter. Outside the air was hot with exhaust. The chalk sweated through the case like a relic pressed too long in a palm. By 10:22 a.m. he sat at the registrar's steps with his box. Students passed by without pause. Laughter climbed the concrete. He tapped the chalk case once against his knee. The sound was dull and private. His breath fogged the lid and cleared. He pressed his thumb into the hinge until it creaked. A single speck escaped and streaked his pants. He rubbed at it. It would not vanish. Debt followed, bills stacked in uneven piles. Envelopes with windows revealed red notices. He flipped them, but the numbers showed through. At night he stacked them on the kitchen table under a single bulb that hummed. The bulb swayed when trucks passed. The papers shifted like thin wings. He weighed them down with the chalk case. The chalk dust clung to the paper edges, soft and dry. By 11:03 a.m. his marriage collapsed. Arguments ended in silence, then the silence grew long. His wife left one afternoon with a single suitcase. Her shoes clicked down the walkway and then stopped. The front door closed once. The sound echoed, the air smelled of soap and bleach. On the table the chalk case remained, its hinge stuck, the crack whitening each time it opened. He sat in that silence. The refrigerator hummed. A water pipe ticked. He opened the box, lined the sticks on the table, and placed them back in perfect order. Each motion erased minutes from the clock. Years later he returned to research. He worked in a clinic testing new pain relievers. His hands moved with practiced care. He labeled bottles with black marker and kept notes in block letters. He opened the chalk case only at home, never at work. He still traced the sticks with 2 fingers each night. They grew shorter with each handling, edges smoothed. Each felt heavier than it was. At 2:17 p.m. on a winter day, the experiment failed. A patient collapsed 3 hours after treatment. The ward lights turned red at the edges. Nurses rushed with carts. A machine tone held and would not break. A doctor muttered, "Toxic reaction." The words landed like stones. The bottle with his handwriting on the label was sealed in a bag. His name followed. The chalk case sat in his locker that day. The sticks lay still, dusting each other inside their narrow bed. An inquiry began. Papers rustled. Gloves snapped. His notes were photographed. One page held a chalk smudge in the margin. A committee met in a windowless room. Their voices were flat, echoing off cinder block. The air was dry. He sat in a chair without arms. At 5:06 p.m. the verdict was read: barred from medical research, confined to classroom instruction only. The chair legs scraped when he stood. His breath fogged the plastic water bottle on the table. He carried it out. In his coat pocket, the chalk case clicked once with each step. He returned to teaching. Chalk met slate again. Students bent over notebooks. Dust lifted in the light. He pressed harder with each stroke as though the board could be engraved. The chalk wore down to nubs. He collected each nub, stored them in a jar, and sealed it with tape. The jar clouded with fine dust. He placed it beside the original case. Each piece looked like a white gravestone pressed flat. At night he arranged them in rows. Each row matched a failed grant, a lost position, a closed door. The sticks became markers. The table became a cemetery. He lit no candle. The refrigerator hummed again. The air felt cold. He pressed his finger into the dust and drew a line across the table's edge. It gleamed faintly. He whispered once to the chalk, "Now you'll learn my way." At 9:13 p.m. the laboratory lights stuttered. Tubes buzzed, dimmed, then steadied to a cold blue wash. The room smelled of solvents and damp fabric. A thin film of sweat lined the collar of Daniel Mercer's white coat. The vent above rattled once, then blew a stream that scattered loose powder across the bench. The powder lifted and hung like a mist. He ground a pestle into a ceramic bowl. The crunch was steady, a dry rhythm against porcelain. Each turn pressed crystals smaller, the sound tight, precise, then muffled as the dust grew thick. He shifted the bowl under a desk lamp. The lamp gave a circle of orange inside the field of blue neon. The surface of the powder shimmered faintly, heavy motes catching light, refusing to rise like normal chalk. He tipped the bowl into a wide steel sieve. The dust fell in a slow rain. It coated the counter, smooth as frost. He coughed once into his sleeve, not loud, just a reflex. He rubbed his thumb against forefinger. The powder scratched instead of softening. He pinched it and pressed it into a row of sticks lying open in a blue case. The sticks dulled from bright white to a faint gray sheen. He blew the excess away. It hung in air and drifted toward the floor, where it settled into invisible drifts. At 9:26 p.m. a cage rattled. Inside, a mouse twitched under red heat. Its eyes darted, body taut. He placed one of the coated sticks against the bars, scraping the tip to leave dust across the metal. The mouse sniffed. Its whiskers brushed. It pawed the bar. The dust clung to its paws like ash. It groomed, licked, and twitched. At first nothing. Then a sudden burst of movement, back legs kicking. The claws clattered against steel, sharp, uneven. The sound repeated, faster, then broke. Silence filled the cage. The tail lay stiff across the bedding. The lamp above hummed louder. The smell shifted, faintly metallic, an iron trace rising in the heat. He wrote a line across a piece of slate with the altered stick. The stroke looked normal, crisp white, faint squeak. The tip left a pile of dust at the base. He brushed it with a fingertip. The grains clung to skin, reluctant to fall. He tapped the stick back into the tray. It rolled once, clicked against the box wall, and stopped. He cleaned the slate with a cloth. The cloth darkened at the fold. He rubbed again. Harder, the smell released stronger. He folded the cloth, pressed it to his nose, inhaled. His shoulders stiffened, then relaxed. He dropped the cloth on the bench. It landed with a soft slap and spread a faint gray circle. At 9:41 p.m. he moved to the sink. He rinsed the cloth under a thin stream. The water turned cloudy, then cleared. He wrung it out. The drops fell heavy, not thin, each leaving small spots on the stainless. He unfolded the cloth. The center showed no stain now. He held it up. It looked new. He pressed it to the board again. This time the dust smeared quickly, faster, as though the cloth spread more than it cleaned. He smiled once, a sharp breath, then dropped the cloth into a drawer. He closed the drawer. The handle clicked. The cloth sat in darkness, damp and waiting. He turned back to the sticks. He dipped each in the fine powder, rolled it once, then tapped the excess into a tray. He stacked them in the box, 12 in total. He closed the lid. The hinge squealed. A puff escaped and settled on the desk. He wrote on a strip of tape with a black marker, "Test Class A." The marker squeaked across the plastic. The tape pulled free with a snap and stuck crooked across the lid. The letters bled slightly at the edges. At 10:03 p.m. he set the box on a shelf. The shelf shook under the weight, not heavy but heavier than chalk should be. He stepped back. The lab was silent except for the hum of the vent and the click of the clock on the wall. He stared at the shelf. The sticks lay hidden inside, their tips dulled, their veins gray. Each looked like chalk. None were. Each was a pill carved in white, filled with dust that refused to rise. The cloth in the drawer soaked quietly, fibers carrying the same dust, waiting to wipe a surface clean, waiting to spread. The clock ticked again. The label gleamed under the neon. Test Class A. The box pulsed faintly in the light as if it breathed. At 9:12 a.m. a top student lowered her head to the desk and did not raise it. Her pencil rolled to the floor and ticked once against the leg. Her right hand held a short stick of chalk like a talisman. It dusted her palm in white crescents. The room was warm from the vents. The smell was paper, dry heat, and the faint sweetness of gypsum. Her partner nudged her elbow. "Hey." No response. A teacher crossed the aisle and touched her shoulder. Her skin felt cool and damp. The clock over the door ticked twice and then seemed louder than it was. By 9:21 a.m. the nurse wheeled in a cart. A cuff tightened and hissed. A thermometer beeped and flashed low-grade heat. "Flu," someone said with the flat certainty of a season. The student coughed, a soft, dry sound, then a deeper one that came from lower fields. The nurse's glove shone with a pale grit when she pulled away. She wiped it with alcohol. The scent cut through the chalk and left the air bright and thin. The chalk stayed in the student's hand as they rolled her out. It made a white bruise against her knuckles. At 10:04 a.m. an English teacher wrote a prompt on the board in room 118. The chalk squeaked and left a clean line. He tapped the stick on the tray. Dust fell in a neat drift and slid instead of floating. He coughed into his fist. The cough stuck and tried again. A small thread of red edged his teeth. He turned away from the class and swallowed. "Continue," he said. Paper moved. His breath took a new cadence, shallow and quick. He set the chalk down as if it burned. The student missed the rest of the day. Her chair was left as it had been. The pencil lay under the desk like dropped cutlery. At 3:27 p.m. her mother signed her out of the ER with the word virus circled on a discharge sheet. The sheet smelled of toner and glove powder. By 11 p.m. the girl's fever climbed and fell and climbed again. The air in the bedroom was dry. A humidifier rattled on a low setting and delivered lukewarm mist that smelled like plastic. She slept, woke, coughed, and pressed a tissue to her mouth. The tissue took a pink shadow and went into the bin. 2 days later, the first bouquets arrived in corridors. White lilies, white carnations, white ribbon. The flowers browned at the edges by afternoon. The boards in several rooms were wiped until the felt went thin. They never went clean. Old lessons ghosted under the new. The erasers coughed dust that clung to cuffs and the lines of palms. Chalk lived under fingernails like frost you could not melt. At 8:18 a.m. on Thursday, a sophomore in chemistry lab blinked at the page and miscopied a simple equation. His nose ran. He stifled a cough. His breath tasted metallic, a coin held too long under the tongue. He closed the workbook and rubbed his hairline. His fingertips came away with a fine white smear. His partner laughed once and brushed the smear off like dandruff. The smear did not fall, it streaked. By 12:05 p.m. he sat in the nurse's office in a vinyl chair with torn arms. The room smelled of lemon cleaner and sweat. "Flu," the nurse repeated, marking boxes. He drank from a paper cup. The water tasted like a radiator. He wiped his lips with the back of his hand and left a pale arc. At 12:27 p.m. he walked back to class under cold light from the atrium and steadied himself with a hand on the rail. The rail held a slender chalk shine where hands had polished it. At 2:11 p.m. the English teacher coughed again and leaned against the board. He drew his sleeve across his mouth and looked at the smear. It was not only blood now. It was thin and rusted at the edge. He washed his hands in the faculty sink. The stainless held a dusted ring where his cuff had rested. He wiped it with a paper towel. The towel turned pale gray in the center and clean at the edges. He threw it away and watched it fold over itself like a napkin closing on a meal. By Friday, 3 students had been sent home from the ER. Their diagnoses matched. Their symptoms did not line up neatly with January's illnesses. They were tired, then breathless, then bright, then flat. The smell on their clothes was the same, a chalk sweetness that had turned metallic in heat. It lived in hair. It lived in notebook spines. It lived in the crease where thumb met palm. At 9 a.m., the homeroom read a message about hand washing. The intercom hissed at the start and end and left the air thinner. Students filed past the board and bumped the tray with their hips. White threaded their jeans like pollen. Someone breathed on the glass of the trophy case and drew a line with a sleeve. The line stayed for a long time and then longer. A Saturday funeral came quick. The church was small and warm and held too many bodies for January heat. White flowers shed petals that stuck to the carpet. The choir's first note was pure. The second warped and fell. A picture of a girl in uniform stood on the easel. The photograph had a chalk reflection on the glass where fluorescent bars hit it. The mother's hand pressed the frame and left a print that disappeared as if swallowed. Back at the house, the mother opened a spiral notebook at 5:32 p.m. The page edges were dusted along the cut, each fiber bright and white. The handwriting sat in neat lines. A sentence paused in the margin in smaller letters, as if it did not want to be seen. She traced it with a fingertip and felt grit under the ink that shouldn't have been there. Today's chalk smells like rusty iron. She read the line again and did not speak. She closed the book and held the spine to her chest. Chalk streaked her sweater. On Monday, the pattern took a shape that could be seen without trying. A girl from room 214 fainted at 9:47 a.m. and was back upright by 10:10 a.m., color shallow, pulse quick. By 1:38 p.m., she was in a private room at the hospital with a view of the parking lot and a drip that clicked at regular intervals. Her wrist carried a white film where a cuff had been. The English teacher sat on his couch at home and coughed into another towel and looked at the stain and threw it away. The wastebasket filled with pale cloth. At 3:11 p.m., the principal walked the science wing. His shoes were soft-soled and quiet. He ran his finger along the board edge in room 214 and lifted it with a crescent of white. He rubbed fingers together and looked at the powder on his skin. He smelled it and caught a metallic thread. He did not say anything. He wiped his hand on a tissue and tucked the tissue into his pocket and forgot it there. Locker doors banged at dismissal. Backpacks thumped. The hall carried a visible fog only when sun cut it at the right angle. That fog did not behave like normal dust. It drifted, slowed, and slid down the light rather than floating up it. The heaters clicked off and the building cooled half a degree. Breath showed white for a moment by the exit. A boy laughed and wiped the window with his sleeve. The sleeve printed the glass in chalk ribs. By midweek, the third student was admitted overnight. Her breath was narrow and fast. Her palms were white at the lines. Nurses swabbed and labeled and recorded. The labels stuck crooked and were replaced. The sticky backs took chalk and kept it. Doctors said the word inflamed. Another said viral. Another said nothing and tapped a pen against a metal bar until it left a series of dull notes like chalk hitting slate. The notes stopped. The air stilled. In classrooms, the boards were washed until the felt separated. Water ran down in gray streams and pooled at the lip. The pool dried to a cloudy rind that flaked under a fingernail. Erasers thudded against each other behind the building. The thuds sent small white clouds up that did not blow away, only fell back in a slow rain. The field behind the school wore a new film. It showed only if you knelt and looked across the grass at an angle, and then it was everywhere. At 6:22 p.m., a father opened his daughter's locker with a custodial key and took her books home. He found a tissue box with one side greasy from fingers. He found a stick of chalk in the back corner, not broken, pressed to the metal by the weight of a lunch box. He smelled it and caught a trace of heat and iron as if it had been near a stove. He dropped it into a zip bag. He sealed the bag and wiped his hands on his pants. He stared at the empty locker and closed it softly. The metal kissed the frame and stuck a moment before releasing. The school announced a cleaning push at 7 p.m. Custodians rolled carts down the halls and carried bags to the rear lot. The night was clear and hard. Breath came white and then vanished. A motion light clicked on and filled the alley with a sharp cone. A trash lid clanged back. A bag tore against the rim and spilled notebooks, tissues, a broken eraser, and a handful of pale crumbs that looked like snow thrown too early. Something glass struck the asphalt and spun. It did not shatter. It rolled under the lip of the dumpster and stopped in a shallow, dirty pool left by melting ice. A test tube lay there on its side, uncapped, with a ring of gray around the mouth. The label was a band of tape. The tape had bled at the edges. 2 letters showed in marker through the grit. It caught the light and kept it. At 6:58 a.m., a radio in a kitchen carried a flat voice. Unexplained illness at Westfield High. It said, the consonants clicking against metal speakers. A hand turned the knob. The sound thinned, then steadied. Outside, frost smoked off the grass. Bus brakes sighed. Doors folded open and shut like paper fans. Students stepped down, pulled hoods tight, and crossed into the light. At 7:16 a.m., the front doors took the first knocks. Parents pressed faces to glass and cupped hands against glare. "Open up," one said, not loud yet. The custodian turned the key and stood back. Warm air rolled out with the smell of floor wax and books. Chalk dust floated in the beam by the attendant's desk, slow, persistent. It landed on cuffs and zippers like snow that did not melt. By 7:32 a.m., a camera crew slid a tripod through the threshold and set legs with soft clicks. A red tally light blinked. The reporter spoke into the breeze at the steps. "Unexplained illness," she said again. Her hair lifted in the draft from the bus lane. The lens showed bright halls, clean glass, orderly posters. The audio carried a small metallic taste from the microphone grill. At 8:01 a.m., a girl screamed in room 118. The sound ran along the corridor and split at the intersection. Chairs scraped. A desk bucked. The teacher's chalk broke mid-sentence and left a white scar across the slate. Students spilled into the hall and then were pushed back. "Stay in your rooms," the intercom said, thin and tinny. A door closed. Another opened. A locker slammed and sent a chalk ring down the paint. At 8:14 a.m., a mother struck the office window with the heel of her hand. Once, twice. The sound was flat. "My son," she said. The receptionist pressed a palm down, steady, and nodded her toward a line that had formed without anyone deciding it. Paper moved. Plastic bracelets snapped open and shut. The air smelled like copier heat and perfume that fought the chalk and lost. Classrooms emptied by instinct in other wings. Bags were left unzipped. Pencils rolled. A notebook lay open to a page that carried a pale grit along the spiral. In room 214, the board showed a half-drawn lattice and a broken bracket. The tray held a new drift, heavier than dust should be. It slid to the lip and made a thin ridge. A police officer stepped through the doorway and left a chalk print on his black boot. Another stepped after and made it too. The ridge broke and bled down the wall in a faint veil. At 8:38 a.m., the first cruiser's engine ticked as it cooled at the curb. The school resource officer opened doors for uniformed men and women who spoke little and carried clean bags. Their radios hissed with clipped breaths. The gym became a holding space. The floor squeaked with soft shoes. A teacher arranged chairs in lines and then in new lines when the first lines filled. Water in a stack of coolers tasted like hose and copper. Students held cups without drinking. By 9:02 a.m., the heat had risen and held. Coats came off. The smell of bodies layered under the institutional lemon. Someone coughed and wiped a sleeve. Parents paced a rectangle into the floor polish. The white dust of learning moved under their soles and became the white dust of death. It stuck to rubber letters on the gym banner and made them dim. It settled on hair. It softened outlines until edges were gone. The principal walked the science hall with a detective. The detective wore nitrile gloves that squeaked faintly against the paint. He touched a locker, then the board lip in 214, then the faucet. His gloves whooshed when he pulled them off. He reached for another pair and the box creaked. The chalk on his first gloves printed the second in a ghost shape before they were even used. He did not comment. He bagged them anyway. At 9:27 a.m. the announcement system coughed. "Early dismissal pending," it said. "Await further instruction." The words scattered before they settled. Classroom doors stood open. Inside, sentences froze at mid-stroke. Diagrams looked like bones under skin. The erasers lay face down. A teacher who had not left wrote one more word, then set the chalk down carefully as if it might roll. He pressed a finger into the tray and lifted it. The print held like plaster. News vans lined the curb by 9:41 a.m. Satellite dishes tilted like petals to a pale sky. Cables coiled black against the sidewalk. A man in a headset walked backward, counting with his fingers, and swung around the camera. He stepped onto a chalk skid and righted himself. His shoe wore the dust as a low shine. At 10:06 a.m. a nurse in the gym clipped a pulse ox to a girl's finger. It glowed red through the chalk film on her skin. The number changed, then returned, then changed again. Her breath whistled on the end of the exhale. "Breathe," the nurse said. The girl breathed. The nurse peeled off the clip and left a red crescent where light had warmed the dust. She wiped at it and it didn't wipe. At 10:23 a.m., the detective at 214 opened the top drawer of the teacher's desk and found rubber bands, chalk stubs, paper clips, and a folded towel stiff with powder. He closed it. He opened the second. Markers, an old syllabus, a pad with impressions of words written hard enough to press through. He closed it. He tugged at the third. It stuck. He lifted, then pulled. The wood scraped and then gave. The drawer came open with a smell of pencil shavings and something faint and hot. Inside lay a single sheet, folded twice, edges white where powder had caked. He lifted it with 2 fingers. Chalk dust fell in a thin line to the floor. He opened the paper. Names marched in square hand, columned and numbered. Ages in a second column, periods in a third, margin notes in small caps. The last line ran in blunt red across the bottom like underlining and a warning. Control group. He held the paper in the light. The red had a granular sheen. It looked like chalk had written it. It had squeaked and dragged when it formed those letters. The O's were closed tight. The P had a bubble in its loop where the grit had skated. He slid the sheet into a sleeve. The sleeve clouded with powder at the edges, then cleared where he smoothed it. At 10:47 a.m., a second officer lifted the blue chalk box from the tray. He turned it. Fine dust slid inside and left a fog on the lid. He shook it once next to his ear. The sticks clicked softly, not like hollow white, more like small stones. He set it on a scale on the cart. Numbers jumped. He wrote them down. He pressed a strip of tape across the hinge and printed a number. The tape took chalk and held it. By 11 a.m., the halls were mostly empty. The sound remained. Distant radios. A cart's rubber wheel with a flat point thumping at each turn. The building's breath through vents that could not choose a temperature. In one classroom, a projector fan spun alone, blowing a thin stream across a keyboard that carried a pale rim on every key. The rim made the keys look worn, then new again, then wrong. Parents still hit doors. "My daughter," a father said, and the glass shivered under his fist. The principal opened and stepped into the cold and closed it behind him. Steam left his mouth and broke. The father's knuckles were white and dusted. He looked at them, then at the principal's sleeve, then at the door. He did not wipe them clean. At 11:29 a.m., a city health inspector arrived with a small case. She unlatched it and shook 2 tubes into her palm. The tubes clicked like teeth. She scraped a swab along the board lip, along the tray, inside the chalk box seam. The swab heads browned at the tips. She capped them and wrote with a pen that dug into the label. Her letters were thin and fast. The pen squeaked where chalk crossed the paper. The detective carried the control group sheet into the office by 11:38 a.m. He laid it on a clean blotter. The powder made a print of the fold. He did not smooth it. He pointed with one knuckle. The principal Reed then did not. He looked at the red again. The air in the room tasted like battery penny. The clock ticked and slowed. At 12:03 p.m. the intercom announced dismissal. Doors opened like lungs releasing. The gym emptied down the middle and then the edges. Outside, the sky had gone white. Snow that was not snow moved at knee height and dropped out of the air. Students walked through it and did not look down. Their coats shone with a dull patina when the light hit at an angle. Cameras caught it and called it glare. By 12:41 p.m. the detective stood in a narrow room that held old monitors, a rolling chair with a rip in the seat, and the smell of wires heated just under hot. The security manager rewound with a jog wheel. The screens flickered and showed the date in block digits that jittered when the tape sped. The hallway outside 214 ran backward. Students walked in reverse. A custodian unbanged erasers in a puff that returned to their faces. The clock on the wall in the picture flipped minutes like cards. He slowed at the first late hour. The building was dark except for safety strips and a hum from exit signs. A shape moved at the far end, small in the lens, then larger. A man in a white coat came into view with an even pace. He carried a blue box at his side, the lid taped, the tape crooked. He stopped at room 214, worked the key, and stepped in. The time code at the top right clicked once and held on a number that left the room colder to look at. 11:47 p.m. He re-emerged 3 minutes later without the box. The camera did not follow him. It watched the empty hall and the unbroken line of light along the floor. The time code advanced. The chalk in the tray waited without moving. The board held its half sentence. The night kept the hinge click. At 7:12 a.m. the state lab lit its scopes. Cold bars hummed over stainless benches. A technician slid a glass slide into the stage and lowered a lens until it kissed the cover slip. The room smelled of ethanol, cardboard, and old air trapped in tubes. On the slide, chalk dust resolved into angular crystals. Between the plates lay darker shards that flashed under polarized light, tiny slivers bright as filings. The tech adjusted fine focus. The white crystals crumbled at the edges. The darker ones held shape and sent thin rainbows to the eye. A note went to the ledger. Non-gypsum inclusions present. Heavy microparticulate. Unusual density. The pencil left a pale streak of dust on the page where his hand had rested. At 7:46 a.m. a detective opened the door to room 214. The board waited with a half sentence. The tray wore a ridge. The air was cold and dry. He pulled gloves and sealed the cuffs with tape. Chalk leapt to the tape and stuck in a lace that glowed under the light. He pressed the chalk box into a clean bag. The lid tapped the plastic and left a ghost circle. He folded the top twice and sealed it with a strip. The strip took the dust and kept it as a print. By 8:09 a.m. the science prep room warmed under a ceiling vent that coughed, then steadied. The detective ran a hand along countertop edges, then checked under the sink, then the cabinet near the kiln. His glove caught on a rough spot behind the metal. He leaned in. Air near the kiln gritted against his cheek with heat that should not have been there this early. He reached blind and felt glass, slick and round. He brought it out slowly. A test tube lay on his palm. Its side wore a faint fog where moisture had lifted and dried. The bottom gave a ghost of warmth to his glove. The mouth was ringed in dull gray like ash rubbed into skin. He bagged it and marked the time. At 8:27 a.m. a forensics officer swabbed the board lip, the tray seam, the desk handles, the faucet head, the towel drawer. The swabs browned at the tips. Each clicked into a tube. Labels squeaked under a fine point. The squeak carried down the corridor. The sound met a classroom where students sat in rows under substitute supervision and made that room still too. A clock ticked. A vent pushed the white down in a slow slide that did not fit what dust usually did. At 9:03 a.m. the test tube met the gas chromatograph. The lab smelled like hot plastic and metal breath. The machine hummed. A needle moved behind smoked glass and sipped the air above the sample. Numbers climbed and wrote themselves onto a small screen with a green glow. Peaks rose and held. The technician wrote another note. Pattern suggests heavy element admixture. Rare profile. She circled rare twice. Chalk on the bench hemming the logbook smeared onto her sleeve and left a pale cuff. At 9:41 a.m. the detective stood in a records office that had no windows. Fluorescence buzzed around a fly that had survived winter by hiding in the vent. The file clerk wore finger cots which shushed when they turned thin pages. The request had come as a courtesy call across agencies. A name, a date, a facility. The clerk found a box, then a folder, then a report with corners bent. The report smelled like the cardboard it had lived in. It described a clinical event at 2:17 p.m. years earlier. A patient had collapsed after a trial compound. The note spoke of a toxic response. The handwriting in the margins was square and precise. A photograph showed a vial with a label in that same hand. The lab analysis listed microparticulates and heavy element trace. The word similar sat in the comparison table like a weight. The clerk slid the file across the desk and let go as if relieved. By 10:12 a.m., a pair of city detectives waited outside the teacher workroom. Coffee steamed in a bulk pot and smelled burnt at the edges. A copier warmed the thin air. He entered with a stack of quizzes, a white coat, and a measured step. His glasses held a fine fog at the corners that cleared when he turned. Daniel Mercer, one detective said. The syllables clicked. He looked up. The room held its breath. A teacher at the sink twisted the faucet off. The drip kept counting. "Walk with us," the other said. He set the quizzes down and brushed the top page square. Chalk fell from the edge. He patted a pocket, then another. He lifted his coat and set it over the back of a chair, then took another coat from a hook. The coats were the same white. One wore a chalked cuff. One looked new. He put on the second. He lifted a lanyard from the desk. He slid the badge around his neck. The badge turned and showed the seal. Students crossed the doorway on a hall pass and dipped their chins, the reflex of a greeting. "Morning, Mr. Mercer," one said. He nodded once. He stepped past the detectives and into the hall's noise like a current. At 10:19 a.m. the detectives moved with him. The hall was colder there than in the workroom. A vent blew across their faces. Chalk shimmered in the beam from a side window and fell, a quiet snow that avoided rising. He stopped at the door to 214. His key moved in, then stalled. A gloved hand reached past him and held the key in place without turning. "Hold," the detective said. Another officer arrived. The door opened under a different key, leaving his key in the air unsupported. The room exhaled a familiar powder. He stood by the threshold. The detectives walked the perimeter in slow lines. They touched little. They looked much. The chalk box was gone from the tray. The lip of the tray showed a clean rectangle where it had sat. The rectangle had a darker border like a frame lifted from a wall. On the desk, a towel lay folded. It left a pale rectangle on the laminate. An officer lifted it with tongs. It made a soft breath when it unfolded. At 11:06 a.m. the lab called the scene. The voice was steady. "Microparticulates consistent with heavy metal composite bound in inert matrix," it said. The detective wrote the phrase as it came, letter by letter. The pen left a clean line through chalk dust that had settled while they stood there. A heater clicked and stopped. Silence enlarged each step. At 11:39 a.m., a school nurse walked in carrying a bag of personal effects she had logged earlier. Inside lay notebooks, a pencil case, a lunch card, and a blue plastic chalk box sealed in clear plastic. The lid carried a small smear, brown at the hinge. It was thin and crescent, the size of a thumbnail pressed too hard. "Found it in the ER intake," she said low. The detective lifted the bag and tilted it to the light. The brown mark shone darker under glare. Chalk surrounding it glittered. He set the bag on a clean field and cut the seal with a slit that did not touch the hinge. At 12:07 p.m. he photographed the smear with a scale. The flash made the chalk flare white and the smear go almost black. The plastic fogged a breath at the left edge where his hand steadied the frame. He swabbed once, then twice, then a control. The swab heads took on a shallow color. He capped them and marked them in small block letters. The words looked like the list in the drawer: square, certain, unadorned. By 12:48 p.m. Daniel Mercer stood in the main hall as a counselor asked if he would come to the office. He nodded and walked. Students made room without thinking. He moved inside their space like a thread pulled through cloth. The detectives watched from 20 feet. An officer bent to tie a shoe and checked the hem of a white coat for dust. It was clean. The other coat on the chair down the hall shed its cuff quietly onto the dark seat. At 1:22 p.m. the test tube behind the kiln cooled to room temperature. The bag cloud had faded. A printed label waited beside it with a number and a barcode. A second tube from the chalk box hinge rode in a rack toward a different room where a centrifuge clicked up to speed. The building smelled of heat and chemistry, and the muted metallic of old radiators half on. The chalk between keys on a lab keyboard softened under skin and filed away, but not completely. At 4:16 p.m. the clerk from records delivered certified copies of the old clinic sanction. The seal pinched the paper. The staples creaked. The language matched the new lab's notes in rhythm if not exact words. The comparison needed no adjectives. It lay on the table like a mirror behind dust. At 6:27 p.m. a phone rang in the detective's chest pocket as he stood by the west stairwell where late sun drew white ladders on the wall. The line cracked once, then steadied. The lab used numbers only. DNA profile from hinge smear complete, the voice said. Match probability greater than 99. 99. Source identification, Mercer Daniel. The detective wrote it as spoken. He underlined once. He looked at his thumb. Chalk had printed it without his noticing. He did not wipe it away. The bag on the table held the chalk like a museum kept bones. The smear on the hinge had given heat to a name. The dust had been silent. The blood was not. At 7:15 a.m. the classroom held its regular light. Fluorescent bars hummed. A heater clicked and stayed on. Daniel Mercer stood at the board with a stick of chalk between finger and thumb. He wrote a bracket and a charge. The tip squeaked and left a bright edge. Dust fell in a careful slant to the tray. Students watched the line form and waited for the next. The smell was paper, warm vents, and a faint metallic note that rode under the gypsum. The door opened without a knock. Two officers stepped in, shoes quiet on the tile. Their vests carried a dull shine. One held a folded paper, the other kept both hands free. "Mr. Mercer," the first said. His voice touched the room and stopped. Chairs shifted. A pencil rolled. Chalk paused an inch above the slate and made a white dot where it stalled. He turned. He lifted both hands. The chalk stayed trapped in the right. Dust shook loose and fell in a thin veil from his palm. The room cooled half a degree. The heater clicked and waited. A girl at the front swallowed. The board held a half sentence in numbers and arrows. In the unfinished space the slate looked like a black form ready for names. "Hands," the second officer said. He opened his right hand. The chalk dropped. It struck the tray with a soft crack and split. A white scar marked the slate at the point where it had left his grip. He turned and placed his fingertips on the ledge. His hands showed dry and pale, the lines full of powder. The cuffs clicked once and then again. The sound was small and final. Dust rose from the seam where metal met sleeve. At 7:18 a.m. the class emptied. Chairs scraped in a scatter. The hallway took them and closed. A school resource officer held a palm up at the door and looked past it. The two detectives moved Mercer to the threshold. The chalk print on his cuff rubbed against the door jamb and left a crescent. In the tray, the two halves of the broken stick lay like bone cut clean. They walked the corridor. Lockers reflected them in long blue bars. Students along the wall pressed back without thinking. Some dipped their chins, habitual, as if he still counted for order. "Morning," one said by reflex. He did not answer. The building smelled of lemon and hot dust. White drifted from door lips at ankle height and settled again. It did not lift when their legs passed through. At 7:22 a.m., the front lot took them. Frost made the rail dull. A camera behind glass caught the moment and turned the light to hard squares. A van idled, exhaust lifting into a white strip that looked like chalk drawn in air. They put him into the back seat. The vinyl was cold. His breath fogged and cleared on the window. A line of powder stayed on the glass where his sleeve had touched it. A hand wiped it and failed to clear it. The window held a faint film. At 7:37 a.m., he walked into processing under a sign with a flicker in the last bulb. The room held steel, disinfectant, and old air. His belt came off, then his laces, then the watch he had worn down to a polished underside. He pressed his fingertips to an ink pad and then to a card. The ink mixed with powder and made a gray print with bright edges. A tech wiped his hands with a towel. The towel came away pale. It went into a bin-marked bio and sat on top like a folded flag. At 8:06 a.m., he sat in a small room with 2 chairs, 1 table, and a glass that did not show what lived behind it. The recorder light blinked red. The officer set a clear bag on the table. Inside lay a blue plastic box with a label and a crack in the hinge. Chalk fogged the plastic at one end. A number in black marker cut across the lid. He looked at it and then at the lens. The air tasted of plastic and old coffee. A vent made a sound like paper shuffling behind the wall. He spoke. "I taught them chemistry, now I taught them silence." The words were flat. The red light held. They asked if he wanted water. He shook his head. They placed a form on the table. He read it. A line of dust left his fingertips and drew a pale rim around the lower edge. He signed. The pen dragged through grains and made a faint scratch. The tip left a bright groove under the ink. At 8:33 a.m., a warrant team crossed his apartment threshold. The lock gave with a short pop. The air inside was cold and clean. A single bulb burned over the table. The table held a jar of chalk nubs sealed with tape, a towel folded twice, and a binder with a broken ring. White rimmed each object like hoar frost. The team moved in lines, gloved and slow. A bedroom held a stack of boxes. A closet held a suit in plastic. The kitchen held a metal rack with a sheet of drying glassware that smelled like soap and something faintly sweet. At 9:12 a.m., one officer opened a drawer under the table. A map lay folded in quarters, the folds white where powder had settled. He opened it on a clean paper. 3 cities lay circled in red chalk, the circles tight and even the O's closed hard. Dates lay in pencil beside each circle. The red had a sandy bite when the gloved fingertip ran across it. Another bag took the map. The tape sealed with a sigh. The label took letters in a square hand. At 9:28 a.m., the classroom at Westfield stood empty. The board had not been wiped. The half equation looked like evidence under glass. A photographer angled the flash to capture the ridge on the tray, the broken stick, the small white fans blown away from the center. In the lens, the symbols lost their neutral shape. A line through a letter hardened into a bar. A bracket closed like a door. Under the glare, chemistry turned into a text a jury could read. At 9:46 a.m., a detective laid 3 items on the interrogation table in sequence. The blue box, the test tube with the gray ring, a sleeve protector with a single sheet inside. The sheet listed names and periods. A red word ran along the bottom, control group. Mercer's eyes went to the word and then away. The room's temperature held stable. The vent's sound dipped and rose. Chalk from the plastic fogged the table under the bagged hinge and stayed like breath trapped on glass. He spoke again, but not long. They never learned the right lesson. The recorder took the sentence and stored it with the first. At 10:21 a.m., an officer brought in a small spiral notebook found under the chalk jar. The cover was blue-black and scuffed. The coil had taken white into its grooves. He placed it in a tray like it might spill. A gloved hand lifted it. The first pages held lists. Weights, times, the phrase, durability, and air written and underlined. Later pages carried days and rooms and numbers that matched a Bell schedule. Smudges lay in the margins like fingerprints made of powder. A page near the back held a narrow ribbon glued along the spine. The ribbon had kept the edge clean. At 10:34 a.m., the officer flipped the last page with a spatula. The paper was stiff and bright. The line across it was short. The marks were dense, pressed deep. The tail of the K indented the cardboard under it. Chalk dust sat in the groove of each letter and did not move when the page turned to the light. The sentence ran simple and cold, written in a hand the camera had already learned to recognize. The chalk never lies. At 8:42 a.m., the courthouse smelled of floor polish and wet wool. Coats steamed in the narrow hall. A metal detector chimed in short, flat notes. Parents held photographs against their chests in thin frames. Edges of paper rubbed the glass and made a dry whisper. A deputy opened the double doors, and the room drew them in with a rush of breath that cooled at the front and warmed toward the back. At 9:03 a.m., the judge entered. Wood creaked. People stood and sat in a single wave. Fluorescent tubes hummed above the brass lamps which cast a yellow cone on the evidence table. Inside that cone, a clear plastic box held a blue plastic case marked in block letters. The chalk fog inside the bag turned the light to milk. The bag crinkled when a clerk adjusted it by a half-inch to center it. The sound climbed and then faded. The jury kept their coats folded on their laps. Their hands were dry. Their eyes moved in a pattern that traced the seal on the wall, the defense table, the evidence table, and back. A photographer near the rail counted under his breath and let the shutter speak. At 9:19 a.m., the prosecutor rose. Shoes clicked once. He turned tools of knowledge into weapons of death, she said. The sentence laid itself on the wood and stayed there. She lifted the bag, and the chalk case floated in it like a relic in water. She set it down in front of the jury. Light showed the scuffed hinge and the strip of tape. A brown crescent stained the hinge like a thumb pressed too hard. She pointed to it with a capped pen. The cap tapped the plastic and left a small fog that cleared. Screens warmed on both walls. Images came up in sequence. A microscope field showed white crystals like broken glass and darker shards that held shape. The color shifted as the polarizer turned. A technician's voice from a recording explained density, non-gypsum inclusion, heavy particulate. Graphs followed. Peaks rose and fell with slow regularity. The room cooled. Chalk rested at the bottom of the bag like snow that refused to melt. At 9:41 a.m., another exhibit arrived. A towel in a separate sleeve, folded once, gray only in the center. The prosecution laid it next to the chalk case. Wiping did not clean, the voice said from the speaker. It spread. A camera near the jury caught the cloth texture and the line where fibers had matted. The jurors did not lean in. They held still and watched. By 10:06 a.m., the test tube from behind the kiln sat in its own bag. A ring of dull gray circled its mouth. Condensation had left a faint lace inside that dried to nothing as the room warmed. A chemist identified a profile. The phrase "rare heavy element admixture" came again. The syllables fell with no rise at the end. The chemist pointed at the peaks and did not look at the defendant. She capped a pointer with a click and stepped back. At 10:32 a.m., the control group sheet was shown. Names, periods, and the bottom line in red. The letters squeaked from the sound of the writing caught on a camera days earlier. The O's were closed tight. The chalk line had carried grit across the page and left small bright points where it skipped. He chose, the prosecutor said, and placed the sheet down so the red faced the jury like a wound under glass. At 10:58 a.m., the nurse from the ER testified. Her gloves squeaked under the lights. She described a blue box in a clear bag and a smear at the hinge. Her voice was even. She said the words "chain of custody" and logged at 8:19 a.m. A lab analyst followed and read numbers in a steady cadence. DNA language came like hardware, loci, alleles, probability. The analyst said the name when asked, nothing more. The sound of the name was unadorned and clean, a stamp pressed into wax and lifted. At 11:23 a.m., the prosecutor paused at the table. She held up a single piece of chalk removed from evidence under order. She did not open the bag. She showed its length and its blunt tip and its weight, which the scale had shown to be wrong for chalk. "A white bullet," she said. The word bullet turned the wood colder. The stick looked harmless at arm's length and lethal under the yellow cone. She set it down with care, as one might set a cartridge on a table, and stepped back. By 12:07 p.m. the room had warmed again. Coats had opened. Fans in ceiling vents murmured. A parent near the aisle wiped a frame with a sleeve and left a chalk smear on the glass that the sleeve only spread. The judge called recess. Doors opened and then closed. The air changed, then reset. The chalk in the bag did not move. At 1:14 p.m. the defense stood. He adjusted a tie with a small fray near the knot. He put on thin gloves that wrinkled at the knuckles. His voice was low and careful. He did not touch the boxes. He did not argue graphs. He reached into a folder and withdrew a single sheet, creased twice, edges dusted pale. "A letter in my client's hand," he said. He read without looking up. The words were drawn in square strokes. He did not soften them. He believed he helped humanity learn the limits of trust. The sentence sat differently in the room. It did not ease, it did not excuse. It showed a line as straight as any on the board in room 214 written months before. He placed the letter beside the towel and the tube. The three made a narrow row. The row looked like a small lab put away wrong. He closed the folder. He sat. The judge's pen moved in a small, tight arc. The clock behind the bench ticked and fed the room a thin rhythm. At 2:26 p.m. the jury filed out and left their coats folded on their seats. The room went quiet except for the fans and one cough that rounded and ended in a handkerchief. At 3:19 p.m. they returned. The foreman held a card. It shook once in his hand as if hit by a draft. He read. The judge nodded. The words were short and unambiguous. The clerk wrote them down and repeated them. A final word came last with a weight the air could hold. Guilty. At 3:47 p.m. the sentence followed. No one stood, no one cheered. The judge spoke flatly and clearly. Life imprisonment. The syllables fit the room like a lid fits a box. A deputy moved to the defense table. Another stood behind. The chalk in the bag caught a strip of light and flared before dimming. Parents raised photographs above the rail at 3:52 p.m. The glass threw a soft bar across the bench. Faces in the pictures looked past the wood and the lamps and the seal and into the light that made the dust visible. A mother pressed her forehead to the frame and cooled it. A father whispered a name the microphone did not catch. At 4:03 p.m. they stood him. He rose with a small scrape of chair leg on tile. He looked at no one. His coat held a faint patina that the light found. As the deputy reached for his arm, he smoothed his other hand down the front of his shirt, a quiet, practiced gesture, the way a teacher clears a wrinkle before turning to the board. His fingernail caught the fabric once and dragged. White fell from the seam in a thin, slow drift. The deputy brushed his sleeve and missed. The dust printed the air and then settled, a private weather inside a public room. It lay on the dark cloth like frost that would not thaw. He walked, and the coat left a pale line on the rail where it touched. The hallway took him. The door closed on the yellow light. The bag on the table held still. The chalk did not lift. The last thing he left behind was a flake that turned in the current and sank. At 7:06 a.m. the district trucks idled at the curb, exhaust white against the winter air. Workers in gray shirts carried flat panels down the hall 2 at a time. The smell was adhesive, new plastic, and the faint sweetness of fresh cardboard. Old chalkboards came off their mounts with a scrape and a groan. Fine white lifted from the frames and settled back like a last breath. Erasers went into red bags. The bags whispered when tied. By 9:18 a.m. room 214 held glass where slate had been. The screen glowed a soft blue. A tech tapped it with 2 fingers and left perfect circles that vanished. "No chalk," the principal said low. He didn't need to raise his voice. The rule was already printed on laminated signs taped to every door. The signs smelled like toner and static. A teacher walked in with a box of dry erase markers and set them on the tray that no longer held dust. The tray reflected her hand like a shallow mirror. At 10:41 a.m. students gathered under the new screens. The vents hummed. The light was even and thin. Fingers hovered and did not touch. A bell rang and flattened in the fabric of the room. Names were read from a roster that had not changed, though the air around each name had. The projector fan kept its soft spin. A boy opened his notebook and rubbed a corner. Chalk did not appear. He breathed out and watched breath fade against glass. In the storage wing the air stayed colder. At 2:15 p.m. a custodian unlocked a metal door with paint flaking from the handle. The hinge squealed once. The room smelled of rubber, damp paper, and the ghost of cleanser. On the third shelf, behind reams of copy stock and a cracked bin of tennis balls, 3 blue plastic cases sat in a row. The labels were old and crooked. She slid one out. A pale ring marked the dust around it. She pressed the hinge with her thumb. The lid clicked. Inside lay 12 sticks, blunt and clean at first glance. She lifted the top layer and a trace rose, not sweet, not mineral, ash with a thin metallic edge that pinched high in the nose. She closed the box fast. The lid hit her palm. She taped it twice and wrote in block letters on fresh tape, "Do not open." Her fingers stayed pale where tape had rubbed the dust across the skin. She wiped them on a rag and looked again. The ring she had left on the shelf had widened, as if the box had shifted when she set it down. She turned the key and shut the door. The lock clicked and did not echo. At 3:58 p.m. a community meeting filled the gym. Microphones popped and then stabilized. Folding chairs dragged in rows and left bright scuffs on the floor. Coffee in big cardboard urns tasted like coins. A parent held a frame and dabbed the glass with a sleeve. The sleeve made a gray crescent that the fabric couldn't pull away. A small group stood near the bleachers and whispered. "Sticks of death," a girl said. The words were flat, not dramatic. Others repeated them and made them smaller. The phrase moved like a draft. By 6:12 p.m. the screens in classrooms showed lab simulations that hummed softly. No squeal, no scrape, no ridge of powder at the tray. Teachers touched icons with the sides of their hands to avoid leaving prints. A science lesson drew a lattice with light. The lines were perfect. The air smelled only of warm plastic and old books. A towel hung clean, dry, folded once. It did not gray in the middle. At 8:19 a.m. the next morning, a memorial case outside the office held white carnations that did not brown because they were silk. Names were etched on a plate that caught the fluorescence and threw them back in thin strips. Beside the flowers, under glass, a single chalk nub rested on black velvet. A placard read, "Evidence, do not touch." The nub looked small and harmless. A fingerprint on the glass above it never wiped completely. Parents avoided white candies at checkout aisles. Teachers stopped brushing sleeves against door frames. Students traced letters on fogged bus windows with knuckles instead of fingers. The letters dripped and dried and left no residue. A rumor started that the old dust lived in the vents. Maintenance pulled the grates and found only lint and string. The rumor stayed. At 4:27 p.m. the custodian returned to the storage room with a box of paper towels. The tape on the chalk case had lifted at one edge. She pressed it flat and stacked the towels on the shelf above. She stood still for a breath and listened. The room said nothing. She closed the door and locked it and wiped the key on her pant leg out of habit. A pale line marked the denim and did not spread. Chalk no longer wrote words. It wrote into the muscle memory of hands that hovered and did not touch, into sleeves that shook themselves clean, into eyes that measured air before walking through it. The white that once floated now lived in glass, in plastic, in the careful way people breathed near a board that could not stain them. The board was clean, but the trust was gone forever.